Behold, the Aunt Heidi Quilt. It took me a year to make this quilt because I made a lot of mistakes and ran into a lot of problems while making it. So let's go back in time 1 year to when I started making this quilt for the full Aunt Heidi Quilt quilt-a-long tutorial. My name's Christine, and today I'm going to make a quilt for my Aunt Heidi. When I inherited her fabric stash, I knew immediately that I wanted to make a quilt out of this fabric. And this quilt is the whole reason I'm doing the Sew Your Stash challenge this year anyway, because I don't want my Aunt Heidi's memories sitting in a box. I want to make stuff that she would have loved out of all the fabric I got from her. If you have 4 different colors of the same print, you can quilt along with this video. I sketched out several different versions of designs for this quilt before I settled on a very simple design with 6-inch square blocks and sashing with cornerstones. And I'm using a non-standard 1/2-inch seam allowance for this quilt due to the method I will be using to quilt it later. So let's go make a quilt for my Aunt Heidi. Let's start by cutting out all the pieces, and unlike last time when I used scissors, I'm actually going to be using a rotary cutter to cut out all my pieces this time. I need 30 total 7-inch squares, half of them blue and half of them green. I need 42 red cornerstones and 42 yellow sashing pieces. But since I am using a directional print, I need 21 yellow sashing pieces cut vertically and 21 yellow sashing pieces cut horizontally. I also have a ton of fabric left over because I only used about a yard of each, and my aunt went crazy when she bought this fabric. So I'm definitely going to be using this fabric again for something else. And now that I have all this fabric cut out, I can finally start sewing it together. This is a pretty easy quilt block to sew if you treat it like a 4-patch block. Start with your 6-inch squares, pin a vertical sashing piece to one side, line a horizontal sashing piece up with the bottom, and line a cornerstone up with that edge. And I am sewing my quilt together with a 1/2-inch seam allowance rather than the standard 1/4 inch. Set and press your seams towards the inside of the block. Then sew those 2 pieces right sides together, making sure you line up your sashing and your cornerstone. And make sure you press that seam towards the center of the block. And don't forget to make a few extra rows of sashings and cornerstones for the edges of your quilt top. While I was making progress on my quilt last night, I realized I made a little bit of a mistake because I don't have enough sashing pieces for all of my quilt blocks. So I went back to my original pattern to figure out where I made the mistake and how to fix it. And I realized the mistake I made was calculating that I needed the same number of sashing pieces as I did red cornerstones. And I incorrectly assumed I could just divide that number in half to get the number of horizontal and vertical sashing pieces I would need. I then redid my math and figured that I need 36 vertical and 35 horizontal sashing pieces for this quilt. But that's okay because I have a ton of yellow fabric left to cut out the extra pieces I need. And I'm really liking the way these quilt blocks are turning out. It really doesn't matter how much sewing experience you have, you are bound to make mistakes every once in a while. And when that happens, you just have to take a deep breath and try to figure out how to fix it. And after cutting out about 20 more sashing pieces, I finished all my quilt blocks. I planned out my quilt top starting with the top and side pieces that had an extra row of sashing. Then I alternated the rest of my blue and green quilt blocks to create a checkerboard pattern. I sewed my quilt blocks into rows of 5 and then sewed each of those rows together to create my quilt top. And I carefully placed my pins to avoid twisting the seam allowances when I sewed these rows together. I ensured all my seam allowances were oriented in the correct direction by pressing them from both sides. That way all the seam allowances point towards the inside of each quilt block. But it's not a finished quilt top yet. I do need to reinforce all of these seams because I plan to tie this quilt later rather than quilting the whole thing. And I'm taking inspiration from my grandmother's tied quilts to reinforce the seams on my quilt. I used a yellow thread to tie in the blue and the green with the yellow sashing. To reinforce these seams, I ran a line of stitching about 1/4 inch from the edge of every single block across the whole length and width of the quilt. This step is really easy if all of your seam allowances lie down nice and flat, but it will be very difficult if they do not. And I think that turned out pretty well. I also want to add a border to this quilt, but I've been flip-flopping a lot on what color I want to use for that. Red is a no because I don't like the way it looks sitting next to the red cornerstones. And yellow is out for the same reason. Then I thought about blue and how it would stand out against the other colors and contrast too much because it's so much darker. And that left me with green, but the green looked too washed out next to all the other colors. Then I came back to blue because adding a dark blue border will help balance out all the dark blue in the quilt blocks. And I'm going with a red binding to help balance out that red color in the middle. And without further ado, let's go put a border on this quilt. You can cut your border strips as wide as you need them to be. I'm cutting mine to 3 inches wide each. I also cut vertical and horizontal strips out of my border because my print is a one-directional print. I pressed the seam allowance on the borders of the quilt to the outside and stitched the seam allowance down the same way I did with the rest of the quilt. I'm really glad I went with blue in the end after flip-flopping a bunch on what color to choose because I think the blue really helps balance this quilt out and I think it ended up looking really pretty. We are finally getting somewhere, so let's go make a quilt sandwich. It was really tricky for me to find a fabric to use as a backing on this quilt because I really wanted something with a simple enough pattern and color that it wouldn't clash with all the patterns and colors on the front of the quilt. But this rose pattern is subtle enough and the color is muted enough that I think it will work beautifully. It does have a few grubby fingerprint smudges on it, but most of them came out in the wash and the ones that are left aren't that bad. I'm going to be using a polyester cotton blend for my quilt batting, and I haven't used this batting before, so I'll have to see how much I like it later. So I made a quilt sandwich using my pink tablecloth as a backing, my poly cotton blend batting in the middle, and my beautiful quilt top on top. And I basted it together using quilting pins. I basted a few pins in each corner, each side, and on every other block. My quilt sandwich is ready, and now I can go quilt this thing. The polyester fabric this tablecloth is made out of will snag really easily if I quilt it with a machine. So I'm going to have to hand quilt this, which isn't a problem because I don't mind hand quilting, but it's still a major concern with this fabric. But then I thought about all the German church lady quilts I've seen, including the ones my grandmother makes, that are quilted using the tie method. And if I use pink to tie just the cornerstones on my quilt, it will look really nice with that red block and won't clash with the rest of the front. And it will also look good with the pink backing because it will blend right in. My grandma uses yarn to tie her quilts, but I have also seen quilts tied with embroidery thread. And not only did my Aunt Heidi leave behind a ton of fabric for this quilt, but she also left behind a ton of embroidery thread. I had several colors of pink to choose from, and I think number 819 will look the best. And my aunt even left some large embroidery needles in this kit, so we're all set to get quilting. Now, my grandma uses 2 strands of yarn to tie her quilts, so I'm also going to use 2 strands of embroidery thread to quilt mine. Starting from the center of my red cornerstone, I threaded my needle through all 3 layers of my quilt sandwich, moved over about 1/4 or 1/8 of an inch, and threaded it back to the top. I tied it snugly, but not too snugly in place, and clipped the ends to about 1 inch to 1.5 inches. The tie is fully visible from the front, but on the back side it is barely visible and blends right in with the pink backing. And I have probably 30 or 40 more ties to go, so this could take a little bit of time.
Hey, Kojo likes to watch his mommy while she sews, doesn't he? Yes, a good boy, Kojo. Yes, you are. Yes, you are.
After tying all the cornerstones along the border of my quilt, I have realized I do not have enough embroidery floss to tie the whole quilt in the same color. And if we go back to the embroidery floss bucket, I do have another color that is not the same color, but is the same shade. This is the number 948. And I think I will have enough of this to finish the quilt with. And that color actually looks really good with the quilt top because there's so much yellow in the top already. And I don't think it's too yellow for the backing either, since it is such a light little peachy yellow pink color. That all quilted nicely, but I am ready to put this down because I think I'm allergic to something in this warm and natural cotton quilt batting. So my review for this quilt batting is that it smells like coffee, it's too thin, and it's not hypoallergenic. So I definitely won't be getting it again. Trimming my quilt along the backing was pretty easy, even though there were a few tricky spots to cut. I did cut into my table, and at one point my rotary cutter spontaneously combusted. I also cut my red fabric into 3-inch wide vertical binding strips. And then I realized I wouldn't have enough fabric to cut out the 3-inch wide horizontal binding strips. So I ended up cutting those 2.5 inches wide, and we're just gonna hope for the best. I ended up cutting all of my binding to a uniform 2.5 inches wide. And I tried to line the pattern up as best as possible when piecing the strips together. Double fold binding and bias tape is first folded and pressed in half, and then each half is folded and pressed in half as well. And now my quilt is ready for the binding. Also, all that talk about binding earlier was nonsense because I would have had plenty extra. I think I psyched myself out by thinking I needed double because I folded my fabric over, but it's fine. I have plenty of binding for this quilt and it's all uniform size now. I matched each section of binding to the proper side of each quilt based on the direction of the pattern. I opened my binding and laid it flat over the border of my quilt, right sides together. I pinned my binding to my quilt, ensuring the first fold of the binding overlapped my quilt top. Using pink thread, I hand sewed the binding to the quilt top using a back stitch. I also sewed the ends of my binding shut. And I clipped the seam allowance pretty narrow. Then I folded my binding over to the backing of my quilt and pinned it all along the edge. Then I hand sewed a running stitch using the stitch in the ditch method along the quilt top. Actually, I didn't like that. I thought that looked kind of bad, so I ripped out all those stitches and finished it with a ladder stitch instead. And that looked so much better. I originally thought I was going to be able to finish this quilt binding in a week or two, but unfortunately that hasn't happened. I've had a lot going on in the last few months here, and I just haven't had the time to sit down and focus on just my quilt and nothing else. But the biggest problem is that I am allergic to that quilt batting. I don't know. Cujo, can you not attack those pins? You just immediately come up and start attacking them. What's wrong with you? I don't know if it's the cotton in the quilt batting or if it's some sort of chemical on it, but every time I work on this quilt at this point, I start to get really itchy, red and dry skin, and the smell of it makes me nauseous. Koda, what are you doing? Little. This sweet, adorable, loving little Cujo boy has also been a nightmare with this quilt. I've been trying to keep it on this coffee table, but I've had to put a blanket over it because he just constantly wants to go after these pins. Like this. Get your claws out of there. Stop it. Oh, I know you want to play, don't you? So I'm going to try wearing a face mask for the rest of this. Can you not knock stuff over? Can you get your little paws off stuff? Gotta love that cat. So I'm going to try wearing a face mask for the remainder of this quilt binding. Hopefully that way I won't have to smell or breathe in this quilt batting, and that will help me sit down and work on it for a longer period of time. I'm about halfway done with this quilt binding right now, and I just need to push a little bit to finish it. So yes, the mask was super helpful in focusing on sewing without being too focused on breathing in allergens, and I got that little push to keep sewing that I needed. My computer broke this week, so I was unable to make or edit or post any videos, so instead I took that time and just focused on finishing this quilt. Sometimes when I'm sewing a big project like this one, I get all the way to the last step before starting to have problems finishing it, and this was definitely one of those projects. I just kind of lost motivation, and having the computer break this week was actually really good at motivating me to keep going. So this quilt is all sewn together, and we just have a few finishing touches left. We need to take out all of these pins. Pins can leave holes, gaps, and snags in your fabric. But if you take your thumb or fingernail, and yes, I grew my fingernails out for this step, you can scrape your threads back into shape and work out any snags. This fabric has been a real pain with snags and holes in the fabric, so I'm really glad I didn't try to bind this with my machine where it probably would have snagged more, and hand sewing this binding on, even though it took a while, was definitely the right call. And after you get all the pins and snags and holes out of your quilt, it's time to iron it. All the binding needs to be pressed flat, and this is a good time to work out any other wrinkles in your quilt. And after your binding is pressed nice and flat, it's time to wash your quilt. It's important to wash your quilt before using it because you'll have a lot of lint, dust, allergens, and other debris built up on your quilt while working on it. And once your quilt is clean and dry, it's time to take pictures with it. And that's how you make the Aunt Heidi quilt. I could not be happier with how this quilt came out. It is absolutely perfect. The most important thing about this quilt is that my aunt would have absolutely loved this quilt. This quilt just screams Aunt Heidi with the prints, the fabrics, and the layout, and even this backing, which was not originally hers, this was from a thrift store, she would have absolutely loved this backing and this entire quilt, and she would have been proud of it too. So even though I did break the Sew Your Stash challenge to go buy this quilt backing, I think it was totally worth it. My Aunt Heidi was always really supportive of me creatively, and she was always telling me I should make stuff and sell it or do something with my creativity, and I hope that she would see making this quilt out of her fabrics and making this YouTube channel as a step towards that dream she had for me. This was a very long year for me, both making the quilt and with other things, and I'm just glad I finally got this quilt done and that I can finally share this video with you guys. Thank you guys so much for watching my video today, and if you have been following along watching my work in progress videos over the last year, you're the best and you know who you are. I hope I'll be able to see you guys in a few weeks once I get back to a normal YouTube schedule, but until then I hope you are all enjoying this gorgeous weather as springtime starts heating up. Bye!